is it that when some people go out with their drone to capture a hyperlapse, they produce something amazing? But when we go out, we sometimes end up with garbage. Is there like some huge secret that we're not part of? Does the average drone enthusiast not have the same settings on their drone as the pros? Well, I for one am here to show you what can put your hyperlapse on a level with the ultimate pros. And by the end of this, you'll know my ultimate tip for capturing the best possible hyperlapses. So make sure to stick around, okay? My name is Petter Hetland. I'm so glad to see you here. My goal through all of these videos is to inspire you to go out and capture the most amazing videos or photos. So if you're interested in learning more about all of that, then subscribing to my channel might be the first step in the right direction. Enough with the fluff, man. Let's keep going. Sorry. We want to learn. Sorry. Okay, let's move on. Well, what do you need to capture the ultimate hyperlapse? Well, of course, your drone of choice and a good location. And it might sound stupid of me to say that you need a good location, but the amount of times I've gone to a shitty place to shoot a hyperlapse and then being shocked that it looks shitty is shittingly high. Is that even a word? So just make sure it's a good location. And it's really hard to find a shitty location, but sometimes it is shitty. And then there's nothing to do. Now, for today's tutorial, I have chosen this huge rice field here in Bali. It's early morning, it's just past 7 a.m. and the clouds right now are really wispy, so it will not be the perfect location and conditions for a hyperlapse. Those are usually found at night before sunset, as you can see now. But for this tutorial, it's good enough. Now the second part is framing. It was honestly such a huge game changer for me when I learned to frame my shots properly. So today it's probably one of the most important tips I have, but I got more. Please don't just point your drone at some random shit that looks interesting. Interestingly enough, that doesn't work. You have to get interesting angles. Well, that's definitely not a word. just do proper framing. I'll show you. Now, on your drone, you might be able to enable framing. If you can, please do so. On my controller, it's under settings, and then camera, and then a little bit down here, middle of the menu, you see grid lines. And you tick all those. So now you see there's lines crisscrossing the screen on my controller. So this is before, after. Another thing you should use is the histogram. And if I cross out that, you go back into the menu, go to camera and histogram. And the histogram is a lifesaver when you want to expose your image properly. It's the best tool on the drone. Now these lines help you frame your shot after simple rules of photography, and mainly the rule of thirds with these 3 horizontal and vertical lines that separate the screen or the image into 3 equal parts, horizontal and then vertical. And these lines intersect, and at the intersection of these lines, this is where you should put points of focus to have a really captivating image. And of course, it's not a rule you have to follow to the point. If you're a bit off, that's not a problem. Just try to get close to these areas. If you're trying to frame 2 objects at the same time and it's not possible to get it perfect, then that's okay. Now, as I said, it's very popular to put the horizon at the upper thirds of the line, but you might have to make sure that the bottom half has something interesting happening. And for hyperlapses, you're trying to capture movement and time passing, and sometimes the best thing to do then is to capture the sky like this, because if you have crazy clouds, then maybe you want to show the clouds first and the ground second. And sometimes it's a mix, and then putting it perfectly in the middle also works very well, because it's a balance between ground and sky. So you don't have to follow to the point, right? Just try to frame your shot purposefully. Like doing this is kind of weird, and capturing a hyperlapse like this is also not the best way to do it, but doing it like this might work because you're seeing just sky, and then maybe you're just capturing the clouds. So just be purposeful when you frame your shots, and you will have a lot more luck with your work. I'll share one of my favorite hacks for proper framing soon, but for now just focus on proper framing. Then there's of course the hyperlapse functions themselves. On your drone you access them by dragging down here in the menu to hyperlapse with the stopwatch. Then in the hyperlapse functions there are only two modes I really use. It's the course lock and the waypoint. The course lock is very simple and can't be ruined by any gimmicky effects as long as you do it the way I do it. There is of course the automatic focus point, but I don't use that too often. But it's very simple. Go into course lock, you frame your shots and you lock it, and then set your interval 1 second, interval, length of hyperlapse 5 seconds, and then start shooting. Now you see I've framed the shot with the upper part of the sky being clouds and two lower parts being ground. Now, as I said, it's not the most interesting place to shoot a hyperlapse, but it's good enough for this tutorial. But wait, there is actually more to this function, because if you put it in lock course, you can turn your drone in any direction and it will still fly in the first direction that you locked your drone into. So you can fly sideways, you can fly backwards and the other side. And a trick I like to use is, if you see down here on the map, you can expand that, you will see the endpoint, but you can also turn your drone to see kind of the angle that your drone will fly on. So now it's kind of at a 90 degrees angle on the line, and I will have a perfectly panned hyperlapse, which is a really nice function if you want to have it perfect, because sometimes when you try to fly backwards and have it looking perfectly backwards while you're flying the other way, it might end up like this. But with this line that indicates where you're going to fly, you can kind of have it move perfectly, and then it's good. So that's a nice function. And with this function you can also use the spotlight function, or whatever they call it, to aim it at something. And then I'm gonna try this, because usually when I start to hyperlapse, then it puts it in center frame, but we're gonna try. So what if I do this? Increase the speed, just because I don't recommend these settings, I'm just gonna try it. So let's see what happens, because usually it shifts the focus on the subject back to center frame, but it seems it might have fixed that. Seems to be working perfectly well, which means that I have found a new way of shooting hyperlapses myself. Because as I said, usually, or before this, I found that it always switched to center frame for the subject that it was following. But now you can put the stuff you want to have in focus anywhere on this screen. I don't know if it looks smooth. It looked like it jumped a bit, but it might look smooth. This is what it looks like. You judge. Did it look good? Please write a comment so that I know if it looks good. But at least now you know that you can use that function as well. And the only thing you have to think about when you use that function is to have something that really sticks out, because the drone has to be able to see it. That's why I chose this huge white building, because against the black and green background and surroundings, it really popped out of the it popped out, literally. So it was easy for the drone to follow. But in other cases, when there's darker scenes or it's dark against dark, it might be difficult. And that's where the next function comes really, really handy. So let's step into that one. Just gotta land my drone first, because it's almost out of battery. This is where my favorite function, hyperlapse function, comes into play. When we go into hyperlapse and down to waypoint. This gives you full control of everything. You can set it to start with a tilt up and then tilt down. You can put in keyframes for tilting up in the beginning, have a middle frame where it stops and then tilts down again. You can turn it, you can fly it upwards, downwards, sideways, backwards. You can have so many keyframes that you will probably make a shitty time lapse or hyperlapse, but it's really nice to know you have the full control of it. It takes more time to set up, but it gives you the full control, which is really what I want when I want to make a perfect, awesome, ultimate hyperlapse, as we said. So we go into the function here now, and the other day I was trying to, if you could see it in the middle frame here, there's this telephone mast, and I tried to keep that centered using the lock modes and focusing on that, because there is not much contrast between this and the background, the drone couldn't see it. It was during sunset hours, so it was a really dark thing against an orange sky, but it couldn't see it. So with waypoint, it's really easy because I can frame up my hyperlapse. Say I want it there. I want the sky to take up this amount of space, and then I set up the waypoint, and then I fly, and I fly sideways for a bit, and then upwards for a bit, and then I set it to here, and then I set my next waypoint. Now I go to normal, and I press 1 second, length 4 seconds for the sake of this tutorial. Another trick I like to use when shooting these kinds of hyperlapses that saves me a ton of time is to think backwards when I set up the hyperlapse using waypoints. So I think of where I want the hyperlapse to end. I go there, I set the first frame, and then I fly to where I want the hyperlapse to start and set the waypoint. And I set all the waypoints in between that I want. If I use several, usually it's 3 tops for me, because simple is better than crazy. And then when I've set up all the keyframes, I go here and I press reverse sequence. Now it will start where I put the last waypoint, and it will go backwards. If you don't do this, when you press normal, have it at normal sequence, and when you press start, the drone will go looking for that first place it started, and it flies slowly, as you can see. I don't like that. I want it to go, you know what we'll do? I wanted to show you, I don't want to wait for the drone to find that keyframe, or the waypoint itself. So I'll frame it again like I wanted it to be, and then set the waypoint, reverse, and now look what happens when it just started. It just simply starts. And as you will see through this hyperlapse, it will keep the focus on that place almost perfectly, because it's moving seamlessly between point A and B, putting in all the photos that it needs to put up a hyperlapse. But by doing it this way, you're actually keeping the drone framed on your subject all the time. And you don't have to trust that the drone sees the point itself. It just frames it by having you set it up perfectly from the start, which is amazing. As you can see, that works, in my opinion, perfectly. It's a bit off on the last frame here, or the first waypoint that I set. So it's good enough. Like, you won't see it. As I said earlier, it's not about being perfect on the spot. It's just having it be almost perfect, at least. So that's it for this function. That's how you set up a perfect waypoint function. And you can use this to go forwards, you can use it to go backwards, you can use sideways, you can do whatever you want. That's why I love waypoints. It takes more time, but using my tip of reversing the sequence and thinking backwards will help you save a lot of time when setting up these kinds of hyperlapses. So please remember that when you use it. Now you know how to frame up the ultimate hyperlapse, what functions to use to capture the ultimate hyperlapse, but this is where it gets tricky. Now you need the perfect settings to capture perfect ultimate hyperlapse, the ultimate hyperlapse. And how do you do that? What are the perfect settings? It's actually very simple, but I will soon share one tip that will help you use the settings that will make your hyperlapse look amazing. You need to expose your image perfectly, and that's one of the easiest parts of the hyperlapse. Make sure you have captured the most amount of information in your image. No overexposed highlights, no underexposed shadows. Use ISO 100 and use shutter speeds, and if you can, use aperture to expose your image perfectly. And there's even tools in your drone and in your controller that will help you achieve this. You have the histogram that I talked about earlier, and you have the EV or multimeter that it's called here, that will say if your image is overexposed or underexposed. The best tool is the histogram. On the far left on the histogram you have the darks, in the middle you have the middle tones, and in the far right you have the whites. And if I do this, you will see the histogram move to the right, overexposed. I even have the zebras in the sky here telling me that the image is overexposing in that part. Don't trust the zebras fully, and don't trust the multimeter fully, because it's not perfect. But the histogram is as close to perfect as possible. And also use your eyes. You have a mirrorless camera, flying camera here, so what you see is what you get. So if the image looks wrong on the screen, it might be something wrong. So make sure to use that as well. Now, the histogram here, you can see it's exposed towards the left, but there's details in the midtones and in the highlights. Now, the last tip is to, of course, shoot RAW. In your camera settings here, you can choose JPEG, RAW, JPEG plus RAW. I don't use the JPEGs ever. As soon as I open my drone, I put it into RAW, because the JPEGs are useless, and your drone will produce a low quality preview of the video. You can also set it while in the hyperlapse function. You can set it to produce a high output. I don't use that because it will take up a lot of time to render that in your drone, and you cannot do anything while that is being rendered. So you're in the air, the drone is trying to put together a stabilized hyperlapse video inside the drone. So I don't use that because I don't want the drone to try to make that video. I make those videos myself. It's like that. It just shows you a preview of the video. I don't need anything more. There are simple scenarios where you don't want to expose the image perfectly 0-0. Another trick I use is to have it on auto shutter. So I set the multimeter that you see down here, the EV exposure value. I can put it at maybe minus 0.7 or 0.3, minus 0.3, never above 0.0, but sometimes below. And that is when I want to expose for the highlights and the ground is dark, because this multimeter, the exposure value, will look at the entire screen average. And if you have a really bright sunset sky and a dark foreground, it will go somewhere in the middle, and you will end up sometimes with an overexposed sunset. And that is really shitty, because when that sunset is done and you have captured your hyperlapse, you cannot capture it again. It will never come back. So for those scenarios, I might use auto shutter and then set this exposure value to minus 0.7 or minus 0.3. The reason for this is that the drone is better at capturing or preserving details in the shadows than in the highlights. So it's easier to go into your software and pull out those details in post, instead of trying to preserve the details in the highlights after it's been overexposed. So underexposure is better than overexposure. Keep that in mind. I will make a separate video on the editing parts of this tutorial. So if you're interested in seeing more about the editing parts, make sure to subscribe to my channel and hit that bell so that you're notified when that video comes out. And if you have any questions about that part, leave them below. Did you think I was going to forget the last tip? The most important tip I have for you to capture the ultimate perfectly exposed hyperlapse with the best function is using a strong ND filter. This will allow you to reduce the amount of light that comes into your sensor, allowing you to reduce the shutter speed and increase the amount of motion blur in your image. Because a highly detailed or several highly detailed images in an image sequence will make the hyperlapse look jittery a lot easier. But if you increase that or introduce that motion blur, it will look way smoother. You can of course introduce the motion blur in post, but it will never look as good as if you're doing it in the field with your drone and your camera already. So using an ND filter is the way to go. Now I use these filters from Freewell. I have these from a Mavic 3 and the same set for my Mini 3 Pro. I love those. I have the original filters from the Mavic 3. I have some other filters for Mini 3 Pro that only fell off all the time. But these ones from Freewell, both for the Mini 3 and the Mavic 3, have circular polarizers built in. So you can help reduce the glare from the sun, reflections in the ground or in the water. And when up flying in the air, you will even get reflections from foliage of trees and stuff. So I've noticed that I like flying in daytime more when I use these filters because they reduce the glare from forest and foliage and the image just pops more. Even in photos, even in video, everything. I just love using polarizers for my drone, and that's why I switched to Freewell. And the packaging here is so nice. You don't need to run around these two packs. They are slim and nice, but this one fits perfectly. It's not too much thicker than, okay, it's twice as thick as two of these, but it's easier to use, looks nice, magnetic folding, clapping sound. And also with this pack you get an ND 1000 and an ND 2000, which is really cool if you want to capture some special images, and I'm going to do that in a later video. So I'll link to these filters for my two drones, and I'll link to some of the other drones with the Freewell filters. I've only heard good things about them, and I highly recommend that if you're going to shoot video, photos or anything with your drone, get proper ND filters and get some with polarizer, circular polarizer, because it will really help your images pop. And these only do this much for your images. They help you slow down the shutter speed, but they will not make your images look different other than introducing motion blur. But polarizer filters will make your images look different. So if you need good filters, I recommend these ones. Now, I'm done. Thank you.